Now, we're going to talk about a special business process called subcontracting. Subcontracting. Let's see what we can infer from the name. Contract. What's a contract? It's something that you outsource to somebody, they do all the work for you, and you pay them. That's a contract. Now, what's a subcontract? A subcontract is where you are responsible for the final product, but a part of it is being outsourced. For example, wedding cakes is not your specialty, meaning our coffee shop does not produce wedding cakes. But let's say you get an order or you keep getting order for wedding cakes. What you can do is you can outsource the wedding cakes to some other company. You give them the material, they'll manufacture it for you or they'll make it for you, and then you sell it to your customer. So you want a wedding cake, right? But you don't have the capacity to make a wedding cake, or you think it's not your core focus. So what you do is you let somebody like a wedding cake designer or somebody who specializes in wedding cakes, and he is your subcontractor. Now, there is a difference between a subcontractor and a vendor. A subcontractor can be a vendor, no doubt. A vendor can also be a subcontractor. But in the context of subcontracting, I'm calling him specifically subcontractor. Let me explain why. Now, this wedding cake has a certain set of specifications. I'm not just asking the vendor to prepare the wedding cake and send it to me. I am going to supply the raw materials. And in return, this subcontractor is going to send me the wedding cake or the finished good. Now, in the context of wedding cake, this might seem very trivial, isn't it? These products are not very expensive, right? The raw materials. What does a wedding cake need? Flour, sugar, colors. These are not very expensive. The subcontractor can very well go to the market and get all this stuff himself. But think of it in the context of large scale engineering products. Say GE is manufacturing a generator. Now, there are certain parts of it that are very well suited for subcontracting. For example, the radiator of a diesel generator is a specialty. There are certain vendors or subcontractors who specialize in radiators, and it's a custom job, meaning GE provides the material and the subcontractor uses that material, steel or whatever. Let's say it's a special grade steel that the vendor cannot procure himself. So GE provides that material, and then the vendor does the job and sends the finished product. Another example, same GE makes turbines, right? So the turbine is going to be something like this with the fans right here, right? This is a turbine. You know how a turbine is milled? They take a solid piece of metal, a cylinder, right? And then mill it into the shape of a turbine and then remove all this material, right? It's one solid piece of product. It's not something that's bent. It's not a piece of metal that's bent. They mill it out of a solid aluminum or whatever sheet it is. Now, GE has so many different subcontractors. 1, 2, 3. Again, does GE use SAP? I don't know, and I don't care. But you can substitute GE with Pratt & Whitney or any company where the process is very specialized, or the parent company GE in this case feels that it's not their core competency and somebody else can do a better job. So there are these milling companies with large lathe machines and they do the milling. And let's say this cylinder is a special material, it's not aluminum, it's something else. So the vendor can't procure it himself. So GE has to procure it. Maybe it manufactures it from some special raw material and sends the raw material over to the vendor or subcontractor, and he does the milling using the lathe machine. That's his specialty. And then finally, he sends back the fin or the turbine. This is subcontracting. So, how does the process work in SAP? You raise a PO with the vendor. You can call it vendor or subcontractor. I'm just using a special word called subcontractor in the context of subcontracting. In SAP, they're just created as vendors. No different. So the PO goes to the vendor. Now the vendor also needs to receive the raw materials, right? So these raw materials are shipped over to the vendor's place, and the vendor does his job, right? So vendor has a factory or whatever. He does his job, and finally he returns the finished product. And what about the raw materials? The raw materials are consumed. It's possible that he might be left out with some raw materials. For example, it's not just raw materials, it's byproducts also that are important. For example, if raw materials are left out, meaning there is some raw material that was not used, there was no need to use it. Maybe GE sent some extra raw material just in case. Meaning, he can return the raw material, or sometimes excess raw material would have been consumed. In which case, he can say, hey, you know what? I have consumed more than what was sent to me. So can you reimburse me for that? Right? So this is over consumption of raw material, in which case we need to give more raw material to the vendor, and he can also send us the byproducts. For example, in the case of milling, when you mill this entire sheet or cylinder, you get a whole lot of scrap. Maybe that scrap is very valuable. This is called as a byproduct. The vendor could choose to sell it, or if it's an expensive product, we might ask the vendor to send the byproduct back to us. And that's what I mentioned by byproduct here. See, there are so many things that go back and forth. Raw materials going to the vendor, finished product coming back from the vendor. Returning of raw materials that were not consumed, or in case of overconsumption, requesting for more raw material to be sent out to the vendor. And in some cases, there are byproducts that the vendor produces as part of the whole manufacturing process, and we could ask the vendor to ship them back to us. Right? Now, purely from a goods movement and ownership perspective. So when you transfer raw materials from your warehouse to the vendor's plant, is it a sale? No, it's not. It's not a sale. It's a transfer posting. The goods are still our property. We're just sending it over to the vendor. So it's not a sale. The vendor need not pay for it, right? And this is also an example of transfer posting, returning from the vendor's or subcontractor location to our factory, right? And when he sends the finished product, this is an example of an actual purchase, and we own the finished product. And the finished product is being generated by the vendor, and he's sending it to us. So from a goods movement perspective, you got to understand each of these arrows. What goes out, what comes in, what is a sale, what is not, and what kind of goods movements are required for each of these cases.